seats, we'll go ahead and move forward with tonight's lecture. So again, good evening and welcome. I'm glad everyone can make it here tonight. I'm Peter Larson. I'm the interim chair of the History Department. The History Department, its partners, its friends, puts on a wide variety of events throughout the year. And tonight, I have the pleasure to welcome you all to the 4th annual Jerrell Shofner Lecture on Florida History and Culture. We're in for a real treat tonight, so without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Connie Lester, editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Connie.
Good evening. Welcome to the 4th annual Jerrell Shofner Lecture on Florida History and Culture. Let me say just a few words about the lecture and its origins. The lecture series is an outreach of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which is the peer-reviewed scholarly publication of the Florida Historical Society. The offices for the Quarterly are in the History Department here at UCF, and the Society headquarters are in Cocoa. The Florida Historical Quarterly is in its 95th year of publication. It came to UCF from the University of Florida in the mid-90s. Dr. Shofner was the first editor at UCF, and the lecture series was named to honor his contributions to Florida history, his work as editor, his scholarship, and his service as a past president of the Society. Dr. Shofner attended the inaugural lecture, but unfortunately his health does not permit him to be here tonight. Nevertheless, I think we should give him a round of applause for his editorship, his scholarship, and his years of service at UCF. The lecture series was first conceived in conjunction with another project to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the landing of Ponce de Leon in Florida in 1513. Beginning in 2013 and for each year afterward through 2017, a special issue of the Quarterly will assess a single century of Florida history. Dr. Paul Hoffman of Louisiana State University was the guest editor for the first issue, covering the 16th century. He was also the inaugural speaker for the first Shofner lecture. Dr. Jane Landers guest edited the 17th century issue, which was published in the winter of 2014. And she spoke to an enthusiastic audience that year. The 2015 special issue covered the 18th century, and Dr. Sherry Johnson, the guest editor, spoke last year on the role of climate in history. Tonight's lecturer is Dr. James Cusick, who was the guest editor for the 19th century issue. Before I introduce Dr. Cusick, I want to recognize some people in tonight's audience. If you would, briefly stand when your name is called, and let's hold the applause until everyone has been recognized. Dr. Ben Broke-Markle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. Dr. Mike Denham, Director of the Florida Studies Center at Florida Southern College in Lakewood. Dr. Lyman Brody, Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. I also want to thank several people who made this event possible. Sarah Ambrosecchia, Administrative Services Coordinator, who pushes all the paperwork through and makes our lives much easier. Tiffany Rivera, whose marketing and coordinating skills made sure the beautiful posters and flyers were completed, invitations were mailed, and posters placed around campus. She also arranged for the food for the reception and generally kept us on track. Kayla Campagna, graduate student and administrative assistant, who checked all the details and helped us set up the event. Tyler Campbell, a graduate student and general go-to person. This is Tyler's 4th year on the Shofner Lecture. 3 years ago, he was a Florida Historical Quarterly intern. We had given him a choice about it, and he's just stayed on since. Dr. Amelia Lyons, who is the director of Phi Alpha Theta, and who has been working with the FHQ to host the Brown Bag Lunch. And finally, I want to thank all of you for showing up, even if you only came because you're getting extra points. Thank you. And James G. Cusick is curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History in the George Smathers Library at the University of Florida. And for those of us who do Florida history at all, we couldn't do it without Dr. Cusick. He has been a long-standing member of the Executive Board of the Florida Historical Society and served as president from 2012 to 2014. He is also a member of the board of the Gulf South Historical Association and served as its president in 2014-2015. If you're keeping up, he had two presidencies at the same time. Dr. Cusick is the author or co-author of 3 books, including The Other War of 1812, The Patriot War and the American Invasion of Spanish East Florida, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2007. The title of his talk tonight is A Murder Among Slaves, a case from Florida in 1800. Please welcome Dr. James Cusick.
Well, thank you. I'm truly delighted to be here tonight. And if anybody has any trouble hearing me, which is usually not a problem because I have a loud voice, but if you just raise your hand and we'll adjust the microphone. I want to thank Connie and the Florida Historical Quarterly and the History Department at UCF and Phi Alpha Theta for sponsoring this and for inviting me here tonight. For the past several years, I've been researching the criminal court records of colonial St. Augustine for the end of the Spanish colonial period in the 1790s and the early 1800s. And I've given some previous talks on cases that involve slander and that actually involve sexual abuse of children. But tonight, I'm going to introduce you to one of the major cases, the investigation of a murder. And there are some handouts for those of you who have them. If you don't have them, you don't really need them. But they list the principal people that are involved in the case, along with a summary of the judicial procedures that were used at the time. I'll refer to them from time to time. I'll also, before I go further, too, say this is an interesting example, just from the historical perspective, of a case that requires putting together a lot of different sources of information, not just historical documents, but as you'll see, maps, cartographic evidence, standing buildings that still exist in St. Augustine. So I hope it will illustrate ways that you can bring lots of different sources of information together to find out what happened in the past. Well, as the title of the talk indicates, this is a murder that occurred within the community of slaves who lived in colonial St. Augustine. More broadly, it involved the entire community of color, both free and slave. I need to say at the outset, however, that this is not a celebrated case. It's not one that challenged or criticized the existence of slavery. It does not rank, for example, with the 1687 case about runaway slaves in St. Augustine, which eventually brought about the slave sanctuary policy there. It is not in a class with cases like the Amistad case from 1841. And it is not a case in which a slave killed a master. This is a case of a common murder in which one young man, a slave who was trained as a cobbler or shoemaker, killed another slave whom he knew well. And no one in the case called for the abolition of slavery or questioned its existence. Why then, you may ask, even bother me? Why didn't I come down here and talk about a more important case? Well, the fact of the matter is I chose this case not because of the crime that occurred, but because of the witnesses. You see here the title page, partially damaged of the case, and a leaf from the interior of the case which depicts the murder weapon. So this was a very public murder. It occurred in front of at least a dozen people who were eyewitnesses. And all of those people were either free people of color living in St. Augustine or enslaved men and women. The case was investigated for 4 months. Testimony was taken for 3 months, although with a 2-week hiatus, and most of the people giving testimony were slaves or free blacks. This case therefore gives us a glimpse into their daily lives as represented along one street in St. Augustine. All right, this is, I don't know how well that shows up, maybe it shows up better here. I'm looking at it in scans, but that's a Costa picture of a shoemaker or a cobbler from the colonial period. And this is the street where the murder occurred. And I will try and point up there. It's boxed in, but it's this street in the middle that ends, runs north-south and ends in a T-junction. And it's still there today. It's called Avila Street. It hasn't changed much in configuration since 1800. You can still see some of the features that are described in the court file from 1800, and you can walk down it today. All right, this is what it looks like today. And if you look down the street, you're looking south from the town plaza in St. Augustine, you can see the reconstruction of the military hospital that stood there in 1800. A little bit further down, you can just see the facade of the Segui, or the Segui House right here, which now serves as the research library for the St. Augustine Historical Society. But in 1800, it was the home of a well-to-do Menorcan family, the Segui family, who operated a bakery that stood in their backyard and worked in shipping. 2 witnesses in this case, a 19-year-old slave named Juan, who worked in the bakery, and his 60-year-old grandmother, Amelia, who was also a slave, lived in that house. And I don't think it shows up quite so well, but a little bit further down is the Jimenez Spatio house that was also there in the year 1800. And then just beyond those houses, this is where the Segui house is. This is the military hospital here. This is where the Jimenez house was eventually built. This map predates it a little bit. There's another house right there, the Quevedo house, that building right there on the corner. And in 1800, that house was the place of business of an Irish tailor named Philip Ashton. And that house does not exist anymore. But you can see pictures of it from the 19th century. And this is it right here. It's this building right, that's the fascia, or the fascia house. This is it right here. You can see it's a modest building, a 1-story building, has a slightly elaborated facade up front. And in the facade there is a door that goes into the house. There's a window. There's a gate door that goes into the side yard. Here, further down the street, you can still see it again in the early 1900s. The house now seems to be gone. The facade is still there. You can see it standing right there. And if you walk down the street today, although you wouldn't see the building, you would see this. Here's the street corner right here. There's this wall. And if you look carefully at the wall, you'll see that there's a filled-in area right here. That's the door of the house. And there's a filled-in area right here. That's the window of the house. At the time, as I said, this was a tailor shop. And Ashton, the tailor who lived there, employed 2 apprentices. The first was a slave, 20 years old, named Marcelino Sanchez, and he had been put into service there to learn the art of tailoring by his master. The other apprentice was a free black, Jorge Fish, who was 15 years old. And Juan Segui, who I mentioned before, who worked at the bakery a few steps away, frequently went there to eat dinner or to hang out with these 2 apprentices. All of these young men would become witnesses in the murder case. And again, from the Costa paintings, an image of a tailor shop, again showing a person of color as the tailor. These are paintings that were very popular in Mexico in the 18th century. All right, so to go a little bit further down the street, we stopped here. That's the Quevedo house. There's the Father Miguel O'Reilly house. That was there at the time and is still there. And finally, when you get down to the T-junction down here, this house is gone. This was the house of Roque Leonardi, an Italian immigrant or Italian settler. this was the scene of the murder. And although you can't see that house today, it's well depicted on this map. And of course, the T-junction is there at the corner of the property, just as it was in 1800. At the time, 1800, the time of the murder, the lower floor of this house was being rented by a free woman of color named Flora. All right, so this is what happened on this street around 5 o'clock p.m. on Sunday, March 2nd, 1800. It being a Sunday, the tailor shop was closed. And the apprentices at the tailor shop were gathered outside at the street corner. That was Jorge Fish and Marcelino. And with them was Juan Segui from the nearby Segui house. And also another slave who was owned by a woman who was a merchant in town, Donna Honoria Clark, named Benjamin, who was a friend of these 3 other young men, and who was going to be, or ended up going to be, the victim in the killing. All of these young men hung out together, all of them went about together in town. As they were talking, another slave named Juan Carlos, or sometimes Juan Zapatero, because he was trained as a cobbler or shoemaker, walked by and greeted them, and then proceeded down Avila Street. A few minutes after he passed, Benjamin took leave of his friends, and he took off his shoes, and he threw them up against the door of the tailor shop. And then he took off his hat, and he threw it through the open window of the tailor shop. And then he took off running down the street, and at the end of the street, near the T-junction, he came up on Juan Carlos and he grabbed his hat off of his head, and the 2 men began to fight. Well, several women intervened in this. One of them was Amelia, the grandmother of Juan, a 60-year-old and a slave in the Segui household. She stopped them and she asked them what they were fighting about. And she picked up the hat, Carlos's hat, which had fallen on the ground. And then Frances, who was another free woman of color and sold pastries out of a little shop here at the end of the street, she also intervened and told the men to stop fighting. And there was a third woman, also a free woman of color, Reina, about age 30, who tried to get them to stop. But Benjamin didn't listen, and he grabbed the hat up from Amelia, and he ran around the corner and into the courtyard of the Leonardi house, with Juan Carlos following him. And once they got inside the courtyard, they began to fight again. Marcelino, Jorge, and Juan, who were further up the street, they came running down the street to see what was going on. The women followed the men into the courtyard of the house. Other people began to assemble around the house. And inside the courtyard, the 2 men were brawling and throwing punches at each other. Carlos had removed his jacket, his outer jacket, and was fighting English style in his shirt sleeves. But Benjamin, who was larger, had a larger build, was getting the best of him and had trapped him up against the fence in the property and was pummeling him with punches. Witnesses said later that Benjamin was holding Carlos up with one hand and just smashing him in the face with the other until Carlos had blood streaming from his nose and his mouth. And here you see kind of a similar brawl from a Mexican novel from the 1800s, and you see 2 men being beaten as they're down on the ground here. This was later going to be an important point of contention in the case. At this point, it's not clear who, somebody in the crowd appealed to Amelia and to Reina and to a free black man of color there named Jose Bonham to break up the fight, saying it had gone far enough. And Bonham and the women tried to get Benjamin off of Carlos, and when Benjamin would not relent, and after Bonham got punched several times in the process of trying to break up the fight, they gave up the effort. And again, according to witnesses, some people in the crowd were actually shouting at Bonham to let the fight continue, saying, quote, "Free people, you was a free black, should not interfere with the affairs of slaves, unquote. What happened after this was a point of contention in this case. Benjamin did break off the fight. He stopped hitting Carlos, and he was turning to leave. And as he turned to leave, Carlos pulled a knife from his belt, and he stabbed Benjamin in the right rear side between the third and fourth ribs. All right, so this is actually a depiction of the murder weapon of the knife that was made for the court file during testimony, and the fatal wound that Carlos delivered came right through the back there between the ribs. Benjamin continued walking towards the door, and Carlos again came up behind him and stabbed him again and with a downward thrust through the shoulder. People were yelling for help, and by this time a soldier from the garrison had arrived, and he placed Carlos under arrest, demanding that he surrender his weapon. Friends of Benjamin went out to him. He had fallen in the street at the T-junction. They stripped off his shirt, and they carried him to the house of Honoria Clark, his master or mistress, where he died about an hour later. An autopsy by the surgeon at the military hospital, Don Juan Jose Bosque, showed that the fatal blow was the one between the ribs that had penetrated Benjamin's lung and nicked the pulmonary arteries. Okay, those are the circumstances of the case, or at least what happened on that day. Now this is a very complicated case, and so I'm not going to be able to go into all the different aspects of it, or the legal aspects of it. First, before I go talk about it at all, let me explain something about the legal proceedings that prevailed at the time. Our image of trials is heavily influenced by depictions in movies and TVs, and we tend to think of trials as courtroom dramas, in which there is always, there's always a judge's seat or dais, there's a witness stand, there are adversarial attorneys arguing with each other, there may be a jury box, all right? This was not the case in St. Augustine in 1800, or really in most other Spanish colonies. There was no courtroom. There was no judge's seat. There was no witness box. All right? All proceedings were adjudicated or were handled by deposition. So the proceedings would have looked a lot more like this. Again, a depiction from a Mexican novel showing a plaintiff giving testimony before a magistrate with a notary or secretary taking down the testimony. At this time, 1800, St. Augustine had only one person who was formally trained in law, and that was Don Jose de Ortega, who was, at one and the same time, the legal advisor to the governor, what we would now call the district attorney, and more often than not, he was also kind of the investigating detective or police officer in any criminal case. And he was assisted by the crown notary, who was Don Jose de Zubizarreta, who served as court secretary. These two men either visited witnesses in their homes or called on them in their offices, or sometimes went to the Castillo, to the cell in the Castillo where the prisoners were held, and they would take down the statements of everybody involved in the case in those locations. All right, now the handout, if you have one, identifies several parts of the proceedings, but the proceedings basically went like this. They started with an arrest, and then with authorization from the governor, in this case, Governor Henry White, or Enrique White, to proceed with the case. Then there was a long section called the summary, which included all the initial testimony in the case, depositions by witnesses, the autopsy, the analysis of the murder weapon in this case, re-examination of witnesses, and then finally there would be the plenario, which was the legal argumentation of the attorneys, and after that a sentence which was rendered by Governor White as the chief magistrate or chief justice. And essentially, what the judge got in this case was a large sheet of papers, which he would then have to read through. And that was how he made his decision. And here, for instance, is a typical page from this file, which was about 200 leaves long. This one happens to be the page where they begin the discussion of the murder weapon. And they call in experts to look at the murder weapon and to make some observations about it. All right, so I'll point out a couple of the legal issues that were central to this case. Since people saw Carlos stab Benjamin, the questions in the case were these. First of all, who was the aggressor that day? Second of all, was there premeditation? And third, were there grounds for claiming self-defense? Self-defense might mean exoneration in this case, whereas evidence for premeditation in this murder could lead to a very severe punishment, which might be anything from flogging to hard labor to the death sentence. The Auditor General, Don Ortega, focused a lot throughout the case on the fact that Carlos had previously to this day been heard to make threats against Benjamin, that he had struck from behind, which actually in Spanish law was a complicating issue or increased the gravity of a wounding if you attacked somebody from behind rather than from in front. And that he was carrying around a knife with a modified sharpened tip on it. Juan Carlos, as we noted, was a cobbler, and the knife was one that he used in working shoe leather. And you can see various implements, there are various implements here, again from a colonial image, and also over here, common cobbling tools that were used to pierce leather. You notice that they're kind of all like, with very sharp pointed tips. Okay, well, one of the first things that happened in this case, before anything else, is that Carlos's masters showed up before the magistrates. He was owned by a company. He was owned by the Pat and Leslie Indian Trade Company. And they sent a representative to say that they were not in any way complicit with any harm that Carlos had caused, that his actions were his own, that the company could not be held responsible, and they formally disowned him as their slave. They did this because they were sure that Doña Honoria Clark would probably sue them for the death of Benjamin, and they did not want to have to pay damages in that suit. The second thing that happened in the case was that they began, after the initial witnesses, the magistrates began a discussion with Carlos. And one of the first questions they asked him was his age. And he told them that he had come to St. Augustine with his mother from Carolina as a young boy. And they didn't know what his age was, that the people told him he was not yet 21 years of age. As soon as he said that, immediately the notary suspended the case. Because at this time, under Spanish law, legal age for a male was 25. And so Zubizarreta told the auditor, we can't proceed with this, he's underage. We have to appoint a guardian and defense lawyer to advise him. So they suspended the whole case. They went to a non-commissioned officer in the Army, a corporal, named Francisco Rubio. He was sworn in as the guardian or defense lawyer for Juan Carlos. And he actually had to put up money, he had to put up surety, promising that he would do the best possible job that he could in defending the accused. All right, so I'm not going to go through all the legal points. In fact, I'll go through very few of the legal points in argumentation in the case. If you have questions about the case or about any aspect of the case, maybe we can discuss that in question and answer. But instead, I'm going to focus for a little bit on the witnesses, because as I said, I found the fact that there was so much witness testimony, and that's one of the most interesting things in the case. And I'm going to cover a few points about male culture, the culture of males at the time in this society, and also male and female social relations at the time, as reflected in this case and as within the community of color that witnesses were drawn from. Okay, so first thing, what led to what you could say, this tragedy, this violence that happened on this Sunday? Well, most of the information about the motive in this case came from the women witnesses in the case. They were among the first witnesses in the case, and they told the authorities that several times during the month previous to this stabbing, Juan Carlos had complained in their presence that Benjamin had been seeing Carlos's common law wife, Maria Agustina. He was going behind Carlos's back, basically, to see this woman. And Juan Segui and both the apprentices at the tailor shop later affirmed that 1 month prior to this stabbing, Carlos had displayed to them in the tailor shop when they were having dinner one night a hat and a pair of shoes, saying he had returned to his dwelling and he had seen a man going over the back fence, and that he had found these items of clothing inside of his house. Right, this, for the time, was a serious breach of male honor. Juan Carlos was in an extremely humiliating position for any male of his day, because he was in danger of being publicly ridiculed or gossiped about as being a cuckold, as being someone whose wife was cheating on him. And as I wrote in a recent article in the Florida Historical Quarterly, honor was central to all male identity at this time. It didn't matter what your status was. It didn't matter if you were the governor or a captain in the militia or if you were a slave. If you were a male, honor was an important part of your identity. And insults to your honor had to be answered. If a man let an insult go without punishing it, then in the eyes of most of the men, and even some of the women at the time, he could no longer be regarded as fully a man. Juan Carlos's immediate action, actually, a month before this happened, was to find out who had been in his house. That's why he went down to the tailor shop. And the same evening he discovered the intruder, he went to the tailor shop. As I said, he went at the dinner hour. Marcelino, Jorge, and Juan Segui were all eating dinner there. There were several other free blacks and slaves there. And he asked them, he displayed the shoes and hats to them, and he asked them if they knew who the owner of those articles were. And all of those witnesses later testified that they all knew that those were Benjamin's hat and shoes, but they didn't say anything. And then Juan Carlos took out a knife in their presence, and he slashed up the hat and he slashed up the shoes. And according to one witness, he said that he would do the same to whoever the owner was. That same night, after the dinner, all these men, along with a lot of other free blacks and slaves in town, went to a dance that was being held out by the bayfront. And there, Carlos at one point actually confronted Benjamin. And just like he did on the day of the stabbing, he stripped off his jacket and he told Benjamin that he was going to thrash him. But Benjamin refused to fight. And other men intervened and broke up the fight, and they made both men go off in separate directions. All right, so unable to get even the satisfaction of fighting his antagonist, Carlos then, for the next month, apparently pursued a kind of vendetta against Benjamin. Witnesses say he seized another one of Benjamin's hats, a new hat that Benjamin had gotten to replace the one that had been slashed up. He took that one and he slashed that one too. And this is apparently the reason why on the day of the fight, Benjamin had thrown his own hat away into the tailor's house and had run down the street and tried to steal Carlos's. He was apparently trying to replace one of the two that he had lost. Jorge Fish would later testify that Carlos's anger and jealousy towards Benjamin was, quote, notorious among the people of color because Carlos had spoken openly to many people of that class, unquote. And some of the women also said that he had frequently come to them complaining about Benjamin and Benjamin's behavior. And as happens in other cases in St. Augustine, ultimately this very tense situation escalated into violence, following a pattern that was very common in St. Augustine for any kind of brawl or fight. Brawls typically would end with somebody pulling a knife and with at least a wounding. So all of this evidence for prior threats complicated the defense of Carlos in this case, and actually put him in very grave peril, because it argued against this being manslaughter or a crime of passion that happened at the instant of the fight on that Sunday, even though Benjamin on that Sunday was clearly the aggressor. I mean, he was the person that had charged after Carlos. He was the person that really beat Carlos up very badly. Another aspect of the case touches on the influence, both the influence and the vulnerability of women in this society. As I've already noted, women were the principal witnesses in this case who alerted the authorities to what the motive was. But they were also the principals in this case who tried to diffuse the situation. Flora, for example, who lived down at the house that became the murder scene. When Carlos came to her and complained about his suspicions about Benjamin, she tried to allay them and to tell him that Benjamin was not really seeing his wife and that he needed to leave off these accusations. Amelia, Francis, and Reina, on the day of the fight, all scolded Benjamin and Carlos when they were fighting on Avenue Street and urged them to leave off their quarrel. And when the two men were fighting in the courtyard, again, it was Amelia and Reina who told Jose Bonham that things had gone far enough and that they had to try and separate the two combatants. By contrast, the males who were observing the fight that day told Bonham not to intervene and to leave Benjamin and Juan Carlos to settle their own affairs. Had the men actually supported the women in breaking up the fight, there probably would have been no fatal stabbing that day. But fights of this kind were a male sphere of activity, and the women were apparently looked upon as outsiders in this sphere. There were also instances in the case where it seemed like male testimony counted more with the court than female testimony did. This was especially true in something called the carreos, which were face-to-face confrontations. Under law at this time, there was a contradiction in testimony. The accused could be brought in to confront a witness, and they would be questioned together about what they had said. Witnesses could also be brought face-to-face and confronted with each other's testimony. And in fact, that happened numerous times in this case. For example, when Amelia and Reina and Sidney, all women in the case, were asked about the fight in the courtyard, they all initially stated that Benjamin overwhelmed Juan Carlos and had him down on the ground, beating him. This was very important testimony because it provided evidence that Benjamin was the aggressor, despite his later fatal wounding, and that perhaps Juan Carlos had reason to be in fear when he pulled out his knife. But Jose Bonham, the high-status, free black, denied that Juan Carlos was ever prostrate down on the ground. So the Auditor General, Ortega, called for a face-to-face meeting between Bonham and each of the women. And one by one, all of the women changed their testimony, stating that they had not known that this point was very essential, and that upon hearing what Bonham had to say, they believed that Juan Carlos was not actually prone down on the ground with Benjamin on top of them, as they had originally stated, but was reeling and unable to stand, and already had both of his hands sort of dragging on the ground. This retraction by the women is open to different interpretations. It's possible that Bonham made a good case for his view of things, and that the women, upon review, really did believe that his testimony was more accurate than the version they had given. But there's also an implication in this that women could not describe a fight as well as men could. And in fact, in the face-to-face with the free woman of color, Sibby, Bonham actually drew pictures of the stance of Benjamin and Carlos in order to endorse his views over her views. I should also say at this point that when you're dealing with this testimony, most of it is indirect. So the notary that was taking this stuff down, he didn't act like a modern court stenographer who takes things down verbatim. we've all seen Perry Mason episodes where they tell the court recorder to read back the testimony of the witness, and he reads back exactly what the testimony says. In this case, the notary was usually paraphrasing things. And if he quoted anything, he would put squiggly lines under it to note that it was a direct quote. That makes interpretation difficult. In this case, I'm not sure whether these women were really giving in or whether they were simply exasperated. Because all of them, said okay. Basically, they said, okay, he was knocked down, lying on the ground with Benjamin on top of him. He was practically falling down, virtually unable to stand up. So in a state of collapse that his hands were actually touching the ground. And that could be considered a retraction. Or it could be considered that these women were basically, saying, all right, grant that he wasn't actually down on the ground. He was this close to being down on the ground. Are you happy now that, that we said that? There's no way to tell whether that was the case or not, but there's at least a hint in it, because all three women basically make this point. They won't say that he was still fighting or anything or standing up. They all say he was reeling, he was collapsing, he was basically, incapable of standing up. All right, so probably the most significant part of the case that shows you what kind of pressures women could be put under in the society, though, came at the very end of the case, in the plenario, when the defense began this case. Because the defense launched a character assassination against two of the women witnesses. The free woman of color, Reina, and Flora, who had been living at the scene of the crime. Now, statements that had been made by these women were especially damaging to Juan Carlos's case, because they were the ones that told the authorities about the repeated threats they had heard him make against Benjamin, and all of this supported, a finding of some type of premeditation, or at least, some type of aggravated circumstance for the stabbing. Juan Carlos, in his face-to-face with these women, had denied that he ever said those things. So the defense called witnesses. All the witnesses were prominent white males from St. Augustine, and all of these males began to impugn the credibility of the women by introducing charges that they led scandalous lives. Flora, for example, the defense argued, was a woman of suspect behavior. They noted that she had numerous mulatto and black children, despite the fact that she was not married. And it was rumored, they said, that she had been involved with the victim, Benjamin, which tainted her validity as a witness. Reina was characterized as a loose woman. One witness actually used the word prostitute, who had been banished from town previously for breaking up a marriage. These are the types of things that women in this society typically had to endure if they led any sort of life that didn't follow the very stringent rules for women at the time. And if it didn't occur in a court case, frequently it occurred as street talk or gossip. Basically, any single woman in town who was under the age of 30 could be targeted this way if she was doing anything that broke rules or ethics or mores of the time. And there are many examples of that in other cases. In any case, the defense exploited this to maximum effect to try and minimize the evidence in the case that stood against Juan Carlos. All right, well, there's many aspects of this case that could be discussed, and I'm not going to discuss them. There's the issue of the knife, which was, there's issues about why Juan Carlos was carrying a knife, why the knife had a sharpened tip on it, why he had the knife that particular day. There's issues with the sentencing, which frankly was horrendous, and which I'm still very confused about. I haven't been able to come up with a good reason why Governor White rendered the sentence that he actually did. But I'm going to leave it off there, actually, and see if you want to pose some questions, if there's some questions, either about the case or about sources and source materials that like this that can be used, or how you interpret it interpret testimony or really anything else that you'd like to ask a question about. So I thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take it from there. First question, an obvious one, was what was the sentence? All right. It's a very unusual case because when you get to the plenary, the argumentative part, there is no argument from the prosecution. Don Ortega says there's nothing in the case, and this is a complete case law. It's very unusual to not hear the prosecution sum up. So the entire argument in the case is from the defense. And I have to say that Francisco Rivera, who was not a trained lawyer, but had defended people in previous cases, did an exceptional job of trying to mitigate in this case. He said things like, clearly Benjamin was the aggressor in this case. Carlos did not, start out that morning to fight him or to injure him. He was set up by Benjamin. He argued that people wanted to know why Juan Carlos had this knife, and he said, look, there's prescriptions against carrying knives within town limits. And then he said, but your honor knows that these are very loosely enforced. Because people who have knives as part of their profession are usually allowed to carry them. And this is especially true, for instance, in town for sailors. Every sailor in town had a knife. Every sailor in town had a knife. And I remember a case where a sailor was questioned about this. He got into a knife fight, and it might have been Ortega actually the question. He said, what are you doing with a knife? It's against the law to have a knife. And the sailor said, of course I have a knife. He said, if I get tangled up in rigging or something, I have to be able to cut my way out. It's a matter of life and death. We all carry knives, And the argument in the defense was, well, Juan Carlos was, a cop. And so it wasn't that unusual for him to be carrying a knife around with him. So there were many things that the defense tried to raise in mitigation. Governor White's sentence was that Carlos would receive 200 lashes of the whip and 10 years of hard labor. All right, 200 lashes of the whip was not an unusual punishment at that time. If you go and you read accounts of the British Royal Navy, there were times when captains or admirals would met out that sort of punishment. 10 years of hard labor was also not an unusual. In fact, it was almost the standard sentence to give for a serious crime. 200 lashes of the whip and hard labor was a pretty grave punishment. And 200 lashes of the whip was close to being a death sentence because many people would not survive being whipped that much. But more than that, when the sentence was actually carried out, the sentence was that Juan Carlos would be led out from the Castillo under escort and led through town. And at every corner that had something to do with this crime, he would receive 10 lashes. And at the scene of the crime itself, he would receive 20. And then after that was finished, he would receive however many lashes were left until the full 200 was met. And in addition to that, he would wear around his neck the knife with which he used to kill Benjamin. I frankly don't know what to make of that punishment. It's severe, it's theatrical in a grotesque sort of way. There aren't that many murder cases that involve slaves as either victims or accused. And so there aren't that many other cases I can use to kind of measure against this one. The only other one that I know of, which was a slave who killed someone with an axe, it was an axe murder, he received a death sentence, he was hung. Also under Spanish law, judges, including a governor, if he's acting as magistrate, do not have to explain the reasoning behind their sentencing. And in fact, Spanish law at the time encouraged judges not to do it, not to simply deliver the sentence and not to explain why the sentence how they had arrived at the sentence. So there's nothing in the documentation that gives you any hint about why this sentence was delivered. It's pretty clear that Governor White did not accept self-defense and did not accept manslaughter. Whether he was convinced this was a case of premeditation, or whether he would have ordered the death sentence if he was convinced it was premeditation, I'm not sure. One thing I think needs to be looked at is this is the year 1800. So it's the time of the Haitian Revolution, and in fact the Haitian Revolution is still going on. People throughout the Caribbean and people in the southern parts of the United States are terrified of violence in slave communities and possible uprisings. So it's very possible, it's a guess, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's very possible that White, who was a career military officer and very strict, very much a disciplinarian, was basically sending a message into town that no violence within the community of people of color would be tolerated at all. I don't know if that's true, but I can't think of any other reason why he would have made such a public display of a murder, which in many cases I think, did have mitigating circumstances. I think if this had been tried in a modern court, it probably would have been ruled manslaughter. And I'm sure Juan Carlos would have received, a punishment and a jail sentence. But I doubt that it would have been looked at as an aggravated attack or as a premeditated attack. Somebody back there had a question? Yes, sir.
I didn't quite catch. Was the knife a reproduction of the original?
The knife that was shown in the image, they had the knife with them, and they apparently drew as accurate a picture of the knife as they could into the record. And this was actually common in murder cases. If you go to other murder cases, you'll find weaponry. It's one of the few cases where you actually see drawings in the records. The expert testimony on the knife, everybody, almost all the witnesses that were called in and were eyewitnesses, were handed the knife and were allowed to examine the knife. And then they were asked, is this the knife that you saw used on the day of the murder? Can you identify it? And of course, almost everybody could, because it had been seized at the scene of the crime. The experts that were called in, they called in experts on knives, basically, and they described the knife and they said, this is a fairly ordinary knife. Ordinarily, it would not be a prescribed weapon, but this particular knife has been filed down near the tip to make a very sharp dagger-like point. And the magistrates, Ortega spent a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of that, and the answer that he got from everybody was, well, it's a leatherworking tool. It's like an awl. It's used to punch holes when you're making the soles of shoes, when you have to sew them onto the upper part of the shoe. And that it wasn't intended for that purpose, but it had been modified for that purpose. Another interesting thing about the knife was it wasn't Juan Carlos's originally. It was Juan Segui's, the 19-year-old who lived at the Segui house. And he was grilled about that knife when he was called in. He had previously been trained as a cobbler. These are all the little background things you find out about people. And he said, I'm a skilled cobbler, but my master, Bernardo Segui, doesn't want me to work as a shoemaker. He wants me to work in his bakery. So he told me to stop being a shoemaker and to give up all my tools. And so I gave my tools to Juan Carlos because I wasn't going to use them anymore. And that turned out to include the knife that was used as a murder weapon. Yes?
Very interesting. How in the world did you start this case and let you choose this topic? And part two, everything was in Spanish on records, right? You read.
My speaking Spanish is pretty bad. I'm getting worse all the time because I haven't used it in a long time. My reading Spanish is still pretty good. Although I have to say, in a lot of these cases, you could only figure out what was going on after you read about 7 witnesses. And you hoped that they either corroborated each other or they contradicted each other, one or the other, because then you kind of got an idea of what they were talking about. So you had to read this. You had to read these files or at least I did several times to get a clear idea of what's going on. I found the case by accident. Years ago now, more than a decade ago, I was working on a completely different piece of research. And I was going through microfilm, which probably none of you, or very few of you, ever had the delight of dealing with. But microfilm makes you dizzy. I don't know, if any of you have vertigo, you're lucky that you live in the digital age. Because when you used to use microfilm, you would crank it, and it would spin in front of your eyes. It would just kill you. And every once in a while, you would have to stop on the microphone and kind of see where you were on the reel to see if you were getting anywhere near the document that you were trying to read. And I was doing that one day, trying to find this document that I wanted, which was actually a piece of slander. It was a piece of doggerel verse that I was looking for. And as I was going through, at one point, it stopped on the page with the knife. And I kind of like said, "What's that?" Because I'd been looking through hundreds of pages. I'd never seen a picture of anything before. Like, why is there a picture of a knife on this page? And I fed the thing back until I found out that it was a murder case. And then I was like, oh, that's really, and then I saw it was a slave killing and other thing. I was like, that's really interesting. And I was like, but not now, it isn't. So I'm not working on that subject. So I just remembered it basically and kept moving. This happens all the time when you're doing research. You find other things that would make really interesting research, and that's what happened in this case. The reason I got interested in the criminal court cases, though, I'm not an expert on law, and I don't think I want to be. I've done enough reading in laws of the time to at least be able to understand the proceedings. The reason I'm mostly interested in these cases is because so many people get called in as witnesses. And once these people start giving depositions, they just talk and talk and talk, and they talk about all sorts of things that are related to the case and that aren't related to the case. And I was like, oh, this is great social history. You can find out all sorts of things about what people are doing that are coming out in this testimony. And the first things that I got really interested in was the slander cases, because years ago now, when I was giving a talk, someone who was fluent in Spanish and much more preeminent than I was, took me to task because I had implied that someone who was part of the gentility in St. Augustine had cursed. He was like, no. He was like, 18th century Spaniards who were aristocratic or part of the upper class, they did not curse. That was not part of the protocol at the time. They would not have used language like that. They would not have used words like that. And what was I going to do? I didn't argue with it, but in my head I was thinking, oh, yes, they did. I mean, go and read American and British military officers of the time. They cursed a blue streak. I can't believe that the Spanish were that much different. And so that's why I started the slander cases. And sure enough, I found not only in the cases I was investigating, but in a lot of the other books that had been written on crime, people used foul language all the time. It didn't really matter. Now, the very upper crust, like the governor in this case, he probably would not have cursed. But the middle-ranking officers, they cursed. The street people, they cursed all the time. And people that work in Latin American history have compiled, actually, lists of the insults that were used at the time, and all the obscene words that were used at the time, and all the obscene gestures that were used at the time. And I found that very interesting, because I think that in a lot of ways that brings people from 200 years ago closer to us. I'm not saying that we all curse, but it does happen that at least when I'm down in Dade Broward, I find that people use four-letter words a lot. And occasional visits to New York, I find that too. But anyway, but the fact of the matter is, if you go and read the record, it's like, people did call one another bastards and sons of bitches, and all sorts of other words like that. And then they got sued for it. And then during the testimony, you would find out everything. It was very dangerous to sue anybody for slander. Because inevitably, the witnesses would be called, they repeat everything they said about you. So you could get redress for slander, but only at the cost of actually having the slander spread a little bit further through court testimony and court records. But that's why I got interested in the things. I learned a lot about relations between the garrison soldiers in St. Augustine and the sailors. Now, my father, who was a veteran from World War II, had told me that Army and Navy do not get along. I've never been in the military service, so I don't know whether that was true or not. Well, I can tell you, the soldiers and the sailors in St. Augustine did not get along. There were constant brawls between them. And the soldiers were always a little bit leery about getting in those brawls because although they could carry firearms around with them, they didn't have firearms with them when they were off duty, and the sailors always had knives, always. The chances were that if a group of soldiers and a group of sailors got to fight, the soldiers were going to get the worst of it because they didn't have the weapons. But these were the types of things that I was like, okay, the governor's correspondence and all of that is really good. The diplomatic history is fine, the relations between the young American Republic and the Spanish colony stuff. But every once in a while, you kind of want to know what was actually happening on the street. And these records are the types of records that tell you that. They tell you what happened to common, everyday people in the course of their lives, what they were doing, how they behaved, who they liked, who they didn't like, who they had grudges against, who they were feuding with, that kind of stuff. Yes, here.
Two questions related to slaves to property. In the unknown here in the United States, you wouldn't necessarily have this type of slave testimony. Was this very common in the records you see, or was this because of the slave versus slave situation?
No, it was common. From what I understand, and I don't know Southern American law for this period really well, but I believe that in cases, say in Georgia or South Carolina, slaves could testify, but that was usually in cases that involved slaves. In Spanish St. Augustine, there was no bar on free blacks testifying, and slaves also could be called in to testify. When you took your oath and signed off on it, for the slaves, they would always have to swear that there was nothing barring their testimony other than the fact that they were a slave. And the reason that they had to swear to that was because in Spanish law, there was a whole codex about, interpreting the testimony of slaves because of the potential that a master might influence their testimony. And so that always had to be taken into account. But no, slaves are called in almost all the cases where they were eyewitnesses.
And was there a civil aspect of this afterwards?
That's another interesting wrinkle in this. There was no civil court in St. Augustine. So Honoria Clark, whose slave had been killed, in the middle of this, goes to Don Ortega and Don Zubizarreta and says, I need an authorized official copy of all the testimony so that I can use it later on in a civil suit. And they had to call back in every single witness. They had to read to that witness the testimony they had given, and then they had to get that witness to sign off saying that that was an accurate rendition of their testimony. And then they wrote like another 100 pages besides the 200 pages in order to provide the background for a civil suit. They also had to have interpreters because a lot of these slaves didn't speak Spanish, or they didn't speak Spanish well enough that they could testify. And all the documents had to be written down in Spanish, so they actually had an English language interpreter there who would listen to the testimony in English, translate it into Spanish. Then they would have to read it back to the witness in English again to make sure that it was accurate. It was a very elaborate process. And interestingly enough, all of those working documents I haven't been able to find. But the documents I showed you, which were the finished copy, they couldn't have been the only copy of all of this because there's just no way you could be that neat about doing all this stuff. There must have been notes of things that they were working from. Yes, ma'am.
Was there any testimony given by Carlos was coming from Norway?
That's another interesting question. She's never called. And I don't know why. It would seem like the obvious thing to do. Now, she might not have had to testify, because a woman did not have to testify against her husband. They could have contested that. They could have said, well, you know, you're not really married. This is a common law marriage. You're living together, so you do have to testify. They never called her. And you would have thought that she would have been the first witness, or at least one of the middle witnesses that they would have called. But no, she's mentioned in the testimony, but never called. And again, I have no explanation for that. There isn't enough in the documentation to know why they didn't do that.
Do we know what happened, or more probably getting out like after the lashing?
That's another interesting question. Now, Jane Landers, you may have known Professor Jane Landers at Vanderbilt because she wrote the book on colonial black society in Florida. She's told me that Carlos survived the 200 lashes, that he served his 10 years of penal servitude in San Juan de Ulua, and that he eventually turned up back in St. Augustine as a 27 or 28-year-old. I have not been able to find that document, but she says that at one time she saw it, so I'm still looking for it. I'm not willing to say at this point that he actually survived the punishment. But Jane's a darn good researcher, better than me probably. And so if she says she saw it and that that's what it says, then he probably actually did somehow or other manage to survive the penalty that he incurred. Yes, here?
So I noticed you used a couple of past testimonies, and I was wondering if like the whole concept of castas played into like the proceedings of the court, or if it had any effect on like, the society of St. Louis.
That's a big question. Does everybody know what a Costa painting is? No? Is there one up there? Oh, there's one right there. These were very popular paintings in Mexico that were kind of a tourist art. The idea was that they were supposed to show people back in Spain the variety of the population of the colonial Spanish Empire. And they went through like every possible combination you could have of people's, racial and ethnic heritage, and and then said, and then labeled, what their offspring would be. There's no evidence that all of these terms were ever put into use. There must have been upwards of 60 of them. There may have been 100. But I can say that first of all, when you look at the record in St. Augustine, you do frequently see some of the more common terms. So you see terms like mulatto, moreno, pardo, negro, which just means black. And the militias were frequently, divided up into, there'd be the company of pardos, the company of morenos. Sometimes you would see them in other types of records. In this court case, every time someone came in and gave testimony, their name as a witness would be in the margin. It would say things like Pardo Libre, or things like that. So the terms were definitely in use, not to the elaborate extent that those Costa paintings would suggest. But yeah, the terms were clearly in common use, both probably spoken and written. So they did play into that fact. They did play into that as a factor in the culture. Was one question in the back?
You mentioned the importance of honor in colonial Spanish culture, male culture. I was wondering if in that case, adultery would ever be grounds for vindication, maybe in a case like this?
It's a good question. I don't know whether that would be a mitigating circumstance. It didn't enter into the defense in this case that I can remember. He did kind of make an argument that there had been previous provocation, although that was maybe not such a good point to make because previous provocation leads to premeditation. I don't know if adultery would be considered a temporizing factor or a mitigating factor. If I come across a case like that, I'll let you know. Or maybe you can find a case like that. Yes, there was a question over here.
So on your sheet you handed out, you list their religions, the Protestant and
Yes.
Catholic. Is that important for this case at all? Was that?
Only it determined what oaths you swore. If you were Catholic, you swore on the faith in the Holy Cross. If you were Protestant, you swore by what you understood in the Bible. So the Protestant, and it was about a 50-50 split, both slave and free black. About half were Protestant and about half were Catholic. But yeah, if you were Protestant, you took the Protestant oath. There was also, I think there probably was, an unwritten prejudice that if you were taking the Protestant oath as being a Catholic colony, in which Catholicism was the official religion, that was perhaps not as strong an oath as if you were swearing according to the Catholic oath. But it was there was nothing overt. Nobody called any testimony into question or raised that point. And it was actually kind of interesting that in this case that they would actually swear people in according to their faith. That they didn't administer a secular oath or say something like this witness is not qualified to take the oath. That if you were Protestant, you swore kind of as we do today on the Bible. I think that was it for questions. Well, I thank you very much for all your attention.